Welcome to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., a spring-like afternoon here in the nation's capital, and a very grim prospect that awaits us. We are now in the process of sliding towards some kind of new Munich for Asia, and indeed for the world. And this is the ill-advised, reckless, and somewhat hysterically conducted diplomacy of the Trump regime, with Pompeo and Bolton taking the lead vis-a-vis North Korea. This is a recipe for disaster, quite possibly for a world crisis, a world tragedy of the first water. Very, very dangerous. And why do we say this? The common wisdom of the blabbermouths and talking heads on cable television is, and some of these are actually quite experienced, right? At least in recent years, they say, well, it's always better to be talking. It's always better to be negotiating. These are so many versions of the Churchillian jaw is better than war. Well, yes, but sometimes not. Sometimes it's the opposite. Would you really say that Sir Neville Chamberlain, by going to Munich along with the French Premier Daladier and selling out Czechoslovakia to Hitler, was that a step towards peace or a step towards war? It was something that tragically weakened the French, discredited the British, encouraged Hitler, divided the British and the French, and therefore it was a step towards war. It would have been better to have no negotiation. Your basic demand, if you were active in Britain in August, September 1938, that would be, 80 years ago? Your basic demand would have been no Munich conference. Don't go, stay home, to hell with it. If Hitler's going to attack, let him attack, and then we'll see what happens. And of course, the word from the German generals in those days was that if they had found themselves attacking the Czechoslovakian fortification system in those mountains around the edge of Bohemia, it was a kind of mini Maginot Line. Well, the Germans would have had a devil of a time getting through. Some of them said, we can't get through. We can't break through this line, and we're going to get slaughtered. And the German people, of course, would not want that. And this is the fortification system that the Czechs were forced to give up by sort of the concert of Europe, right? By Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and that was it. They were sacrificed. They were sold out. So that's the danger. And of course, you're dealing with somebody who's, Trump, of course, the mental instability is now growing. That's going to be one of our themes. You got a couple of themes for today. One is the growing mental instability, the growing hysteria, and at the same time, absolutely eerie, strange echoes of Watergate. We've got these on a number of fronts, and we've had quite a few over the last couple of days. Now, the bottom line, don't have negotiations as long as Trump is president. He is not emotionally, intellectually, morally capable of doing this. He just can't do it. He's unfit. He's unfit for office. Just one little sidelight, right? Here we have Pompeo goes to North Korea and brings back these 3 hostages, right? And as a result of bringing back the 3 hostages, which is, of course, a good humanitarian gesture, Trump swoons. Trump falls in love. And, of course, when Trump falls in love, he brings with him Fox News, Limbaugh, Hannity, all the rest of them. And they go from saying, fire and fury, and you're a petty tyrant, and you're a butcher, to you're honorable, you're nice, you're excellent. His Excellency, little Kim. This is degrading. And of course, people have wondered, what is the reward? Well, the reward is the thing that somebody like Kim does need: political legitimacy, being viewed as an equal with Trump. I guess it's easy for Trump to view all kinds of lowlifes as equal to him. So that's what he's going to do. He's going to cement the legitimacy of the most grotesque regime, failed state. It's actually a caricature of Stalinism. Stalinism was the starting point, and now it has evolved into an even crazier caricature of Stalinism. But here's the thing. 3 hostages come home. You remember when Prime Minister Abe of Japan, the one guy in that neck of the woods you've got to keep on your side. The key to the whole position is Japan. It's a huge power economically, strategically. You need them. Are you thinking about them at all? Evidently not, because you remember that Abe tried to focus Trump's attention on the abductees. That is anywhere from 20 to several hundred. Officially, it's 17 or something like that, but could have been much more. Japanese citizens kidnapped by the North Korean regime over time. They claim that they've stopped, but how could you know? There's no way to know. So Abe came over here, Mar-a-Lago, he did the routine, and he's there to try to focus Trump on this and say, if you're going to make a deal, I need to be somehow included, right? The Japanese interest has got to be taken care of. It's more than legitimate. It's what you want to do. It's reciprocity. So is there any word, any mention, any inkling of the Japanese hostages, the Japanese captives, the Japanese who have been kidnapped? Not a word. And I can see this now foreshadowing a deal where Kim says, okay, I'm going to cool it with the intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the U.S., but there'll be no limit on my ability to stock up on short-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles that can hit Japan and, of course, South Korea. Because remember, this entire thing is an exercise in duplicity, in trickery, manipulation. It's a market of dupes, and the dupe is Trump. And we've even had this said in certain, at least semi-respectable quarters, right? In so many words. So you've got to keep the Japanese and the South Koreans together, and of course that's what Trump is not going to do, because he just doesn't think in these terms, right? So remember, Kim went from being a sick puppy to excellent, nice, honorable. And the word dupe is flying around. I think Brennan has more or less suggested, I think he actually said it bluntly, Brennan, former head of the CIA, says that Trump is being duped in this process. I think that's absolutely correct. Now, more on the psychology of this. Why is it bad? Why does this set up a situation that is so dangerous? Right? People have got to understand this. So here's an expert from the Arms Control Association. Okay, this is Mrs. Kelsey Davenport, who issues a warning, and we'll get to this now in the next segment here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of Friday, May 11th. As we record, we're going to tell you about some of these expert views here that we began in just a minute. The unilateral denunciation of the Iran nuclear accord, the JCPOA, is now commonly regarded as the worst disaster of U.S. foreign policy since Bush and the neocons provoked the Iraq War back in 2001, 2002, 2003, that was, of course, catastrophic. It was a success that turned into catastrophic success because of the immediate aftermath. The only thing we can say about Trump is that whereas Bush and the neocons had the cover story, the pretext of 9/11 and all those people killed, right? However dubious this was, right? See my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror. But Bush and the neocons had some reason, they had at least a plausible, colorable argument that this was an attack and somehow associate Saddam Hussein with that, right? Which was, of course, the fraud. Today, there is no such thing. There is no pretext. There is no reason. Iran is meticulously observing the letter and the spirit of this deal. We've even got General Hayden. General Hayden wanted to make 3 points. I think he said, first of all, the Iranians have scrupulously observed, maintained, respected the treaty. Secondly, that they are now farther away from having a nuclear weapon than they would have been if this deal had not existed. And third, the U.S. and others know more about the state of military preparations in Iran than they would any other way. And the quicker summary even than that is the usual one. What would you prefer? Iran as a so-called alleged bad actor regionally with no nuclear weapons, or do you prefer Iran shortly as a regional bad actor with nuclear weapons? The Israeli attack on the Iranian assets in Syria, and there were 2 nights of this. 2. The coverage here didn't really make that point clear enough, right? This was 2 successive nights of bombing into Syria. And, the only way the Israelis can do those things is because Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon. If Iran has a nuclear weapon, the Israelis are going to have to observe some form of international law and refrain from constant aggression. And of course, they've done this about 100 times over the last couple of years. 100 Israeli raids into Syrian territory to strike at Iranian assets. And we did have one case where an Israeli plane was shot down lately. So this might get to be worse. Certainly, though, from the U.S. point of view, the Iran treaty denunciation is the worst debacle, the stupidest, the most absurd, infantile since Iraq, 2002, 2003. The other thing that is interesting is there may be more to come, and it may come in ways that people not expecting. For example, what about cyber warfare? What about cyber warfare? The general word in the Middle East is that as long as there was the JCPOA, the 5 of the Security Council, Germany, the entire European Union, all Canada, everybody like this, NATO generally, they were all on the line that the status quo is somehow worth keeping. The Israelis hesitated to undertake really big raids of the type that they did the other night. And again, that was the second night, was the big one. And at the same time, the Iranians also hesitated to do things that would tend to accelerate the denunciation of the treaty. And now that's all out the window. But the other aspect that we have to bear in mind is the Iranian cyber warfare, their active measures. Here we have cybersecurity. After the U.S. exit from the nuclear deal, Iran may resume cyber attacks in retaliation. So here's Michael Daniel, former cybersecurity coordinator for Obama. He says Iran now has fewer qualms about using its cyber capabilities without the diplomatic agreement in place. Quote, now that the level of enmity between the United States and Iran is only going to increase, that does free them to carry out cyber operations against the United States. Okay, so you may be getting more than you bargained for. And again, the overriding question is, why in God's name is this being inflicted on us? Now, the full theory, of course, is the notion of Trump being blackmailed and or bribed, some combination. Remember, there was the carrot and the stick. The carrot included Trump Tower Moscow. This idea, I'm sure, is not dead. Trump Tower Moscow is one. And on the other side, as Brennan and some others have said, it may be that the Russians do have blackmail dossiers on him and that they're threatening to reveal those. And that with these two combinations, right, the appeal to greed and the appeal to avoiding the embarrassment of more of these things from which Cohen cannot save him, that is the control apparatus. Now, there's also, however, before we even get to that, the psychological side of things. So here's, once again, Kelsey Davenport of the Arms Control Association. She's an analyst there. And the quote is, I'm worried that walking away from the Iran deal will make Trump more desperate for a dramatic breakthrough at the summit with Kim Jong-un, so that he can prove that he is the master of the deal. So I think it increases North Korea's leverage, not Trump's. Now, that's an interesting approach. In other words, now that, and you could see that's sort of the dynamic of that press conference this week, where Trump, in the act of denouncing the Iranian deal, said, and by the way, I do negotiate. I'm sending Pompeo to Pyongyang right now. So there may be something to what she says. We'll be back in a minute. On Friday, May 11th, 2018. It's been the week of a diplomatic debacle of the first magnitude. Stupid, useless, futile, self-destructive. So crazy that one has to say, how could any conception of U.S. interest ever be aligned with this? It must be something dictated by a foreign power. That's the only thing we can see, right? Through carrot or stick, it looks like the shots are being called from somewhere outside, somewhere inimical to what this country and the peace of the world might be. So, again, the idea of one analyst was that Trump is more desperate now because he denounced the Iran deal. He needs to show that he's capable, that he's not just some alt-right, Bannonite lunatic. So he's got to make some progress, a dramatic breakthrough with Kim Jong-un, so that he can prove he is the master of the deal, right? The art of the deal. So this increases North Korea's leverage and not Trump's. Now, the other thing that we would say, we've been saying all week, is Kim is not at all worried about the Iran nuclear accord. Kim would be worried if he were serious about negotiating, if he were looking for some kind of serious, long-range, mutually satisfactory stability. This would give him big worries. But I don't think it's going to give him any worries at all, because he's not doing that. He's not negotiating in good faith. He's here to essentially dupe Trump and take it from there. So it's not going to be a long-term thing. It's going to be a deal made to be repudiated. And if he can get Trump to repudiate it, well, in some ways, so much the better. It leaves him with better status. Now, the emotional background, and this is going to be one of our, as I say, one of our big themes. Here we've had some very active commentary this week from this guy, Ian Bremmer, the Eurasia Group and professor and so forth. He says Trump is very inexperienced. And here's the thing, bluffing, one of our big themes, right? Bluffing. The dictators, the totalitarians in Europe of the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, although not too far into the 40s, they were experts in bluffing, right? The so-called va-banque game, right? Double or nothing, doubling down, va-banque. That's a quote from the German dictator of those years, right? He said, I had to gamble big and I won. I think that was after Munich that he said that. But the idea is, if you're essentially bluffing, and this is another line of interpretation, that the Iranian decision and in some ways the Korean decision are actually gambits of U.S. domestic, internal politics to try to essentially get the Republicans or somewhat more Republicans through the midterm in November, and that this is what Trump is interested in doing. So he's trying to create the image of a strong leader, right? On the one hand, denouncing one treaty, but then open to negotiate with this other guy, right? And you know, the morality. I think clearly the Iranian regime has a stronger case on its side than Kim does on the other side. But here's what this guy Bremmer has to say, and it's an interesting insight. If you have the biggest stack of chips at the poker table, you can get a whole bunch of people to fold against you all the time. That's what Trump has done with the North Koreans, the South Koreans, all over the world. But eventually, your bluff is going to be called. That strategy works very well until it does not. And at some point, Trump's number of wins may lead to a big loss. But the idea that this kind of stuff, I'll go through some more details about this, but it works until it doesn't work. And the dupes, the ones who know history, right? That's why I think the primacy of the historian over the regional expert or other sort of contemporary analysis, this is going to be key. Now, the other thing is Trump coming to rely more and more on intuition, the gut, guesses, and so forth. What do we say about this? It seems to be he's convinced himself, and this is the most dangerous, convinced himself that his intuition is infallible. Now, intuition in this form is a form of irrationalism. It means that there's no verification, there's no checking. Expert knowledge plays no role. Now, you can imagine an insight, right? Some moment of illumination where you see a path that others have not seen, and then you can submit it, you can show it to the experts, the regional people and all that, and say, look, I think this is something that you haven't considered, and see what they say. In other words, intuition is, in the sense of preconscious thought, right? Preconscious mental activity. This is where discoveries, right? Creative ideas begin. But you can't just use it raw. It's got to be checked out. It's got to be elaborated. You've got to run the various scenarios, right? Where does it lead? Where's the out strategy? How does it end? All this stuff. So with Trump and with these others, the Middle Europeans of the 20s and 30s, it gets to be the cult of the irrational intuition. How about this? This is Trump's confidence in his gut-driven foreign policy grows. Washington Post of Thursday. Trump has become, and we're quoting here from Ann Gearan, Trump has become increasingly confident in his gut-driven, out-of-the-box approach to international relations and dismissive of the warnings from establishment critics who told him he should stay in the Iran nuclear deal, keep the U.S. Embassy in Israel in Tel Aviv, and tone down his bellicose language towards North Korea, despite what he promised during the campaign, according to sources familiar with some of the president's recent conversations on those topics. The result is a foreign policy approach marked by Trump's tough rhetoric, a break from conventions that his supporters hail as a refreshing change and that his detractors warn could have dire consequences for the United States and its allies. Trump is, of course, parroting, boasting, bragging, braggadocio. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them, right? All the red lines and so forth. We'll see about his red lines in terms of his legal problems. Events have transpired in a way that gives the president heightened confidence in his instinct, intuition, irrationality, same thing, on all three of these topics. So we're going to have the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem on Monday. That is quite simply illegal. You cannot annex territory as the result of conquest, and this is precisely why Jerusalem is in the hands of the Israelis. This was the 6-day war. Bolton is now avidly quoting Dean Acheson about needing to go from a position of strength. Strength means military strength and economic strength, not just boasting, posturing, bragging, blustering, and threatening. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Remember, you got to keep up with this stuff, as in this past week. You really had to keep up with it every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And the way to do that is go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and sign up and start listening every evening around 9 o'clock. You get a full hour of explanations. What the hell is going on? Yes, we have a pretty good idea what the hell is going on. So please do that. americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Also a way to support this work. And a viewpoint, which I humbly submit is unique. So that's some of the problem, right? And of course, the other thing is this part of a strategy, right? One of the things you'd want to do is if you have this great idea, right? You say, I'm the new Richelieu. I think we had Bolton saying he's not the new, Bolton, not the new Richelieu. He doesn't manipulate from behind the scenes. No, I'm sorry, not Bolton, but that guy, Father Tikhon, thought to be the Svengali or the Rasputin of Putin. He says, I'm not Richelieu. Some of them say the new Bismarck. Some of them want to be the new Metternich. Henry Kissinger wanted to be the new Metternich. Well, I'm afraid these people don't qualify for any of that. And of course, Richelieu was a great maker of the modern state. Bismarck, I guess, mixed bag, but some positive elements. Now look, from Britain, from the IISS, we have the question, do the Americans have any strategy for the day after? Similarly, from the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, whether Trump has an overall American strategy to deal with Iran, or is Trump instinct just to leave, right? Is he going to get out of Syria, dump this deal with Iran, and just abandon the entire region? It's actually a policy of weakness. It's the opposite of Acheson, who was talking about arms buildups and alliance buildups and stuff like that. Now, necessarily, we go back to the 1930s. And in particular, you look at the case of Hitler and you see that in his case, you have an increasing reliance on the gut, the intuition, the instinct, the flashing insight that somehow all of the dumb generals can't understand. And this evolves over time. You hope, for our sake, that it won't evolve like this over time. Right? We have certain safeguards that we maintain. But, for example, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, marching back into the Rhineland in sharp contradiction, violation of the Treaty of Versailles, 1936. So the German general said to Hitler, don't do this because we can't make it stick. We've probably got about 2 regiments we can put in there, and if the French do anything, we'll have to retreat, and that will probably be the end of us. And the British, you can read the memoirs of people who were part of the Clifton set, the Cliveden set, the Astors, that is, that weekend. And they will say, hey, we don't want to do anything to interfere with that, because if we humiliate Hitler, he'll fall. That'll be the end of him. So Hitler was able to get away with it, and that began to build up his prestige. In 1938, we've just mentioned it, the German generals were extremely worried. They said, look, if we have to fight our way through those Czech fortifications, the answer is we can't. We'll be defeated. And it turned out then that Chamberlain and Daladier got them off the hook by forcing the Czechoslovakians to surrender. And from there on in, Hitler would repeat again and again, our enemies are little worms. I saw them at Munich, Chamberlain, Daladier. In 1939, you had the first sign of big trouble, because Hitler was pretty much convinced that he could begin, after ingesting the rest of the Czech part and creating a puppet state in the Slovakian part. He said, look here, we're going to take various parts of Poland. We're going to invade Poland. And he assured the generals, don't worry, nothing is going to happen. And of course, this was a different story. This is when the French and the British did declare war on Hitler. They declared war first on Hitler. So in that sense, it had begun to blow up in the face of, in particular, the German generals, who were the main audience for a lot of this stuff, since public opinion had been crushed. But at the same time, it was the phony war, right? The British and the French didn't do anything. It was just a sort of a legal step, and there was some fighting on the oceans, right? Different naval actions, but inside Europe, air, land, no. 1940, this was then the time for Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Netherlands, and then France, May, June 1940. And here, this was probably the thing that drove Hitler's megalomania to the most extreme form, because he was able to overthrow France in 6 or 7 weeks. And the generals, who had all been in World War I, remembered the endless agony of the trench warfare on the Western Front against France, and how eventually they lost. So those leaders were incapable of defeating France, whereas Hitler had done it, a miracle. He had done it in just a few weeks. At this point, their collective resistance got to be lower and lower and lower. In 1941, when he said, let's attack the Soviet Union, his ally at that point, through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the generals, they were not exactly happy about this. The population, not exactly happy, but the idea was, well, if you can defeat France in 6 weeks, then we're going to have to rely on you. And even by the time we got to December 1941, right, there's the point where the German offensive runs out of steam before Moscow and in other places, and the beginnings of a Soviet counterattack are beginning. This is the point where Hitler says, no retreat, stand and fight, hold your ground, you're not allowed to turn around and come back. A lot of the generals then concluded that had been a better idea than what they were recommending, that if they'd started to retreat, they would have had a rout, but thanks to this stand or die order, they were able to hold on. And the problem with that then was that by the time you got to the end of 1942, and the beginning of 1943, when you get the Stalingrad situation shaping up, that's where the magic runs out. Because at this point, Hitler says exactly the same thing: stand and fight, no retreat. But these troops are surrounded. They would say they're surrounded. We got to get them out before they're all wiped out. No, says the boss. We're gonna stand and fight, and that's what then leads to the annihilation of that German army under von Paulus. So the idea is that the bluffing, if the bluffing is allowed to succeed, and if nobody's making the relevant points about the bluffing, it can take on a momentum and lead you to catastrophe. And you can see that. We can see the buy-in from Fox News and Limbaugh and the rest of them in terms of the diplomatic genius. Right? Some people are now getting close to this concept of the Gröfatz, größter Feldherr aller Zeiten, the greatest field commander of all time. Right? He's a military genius. He's a diplomatic genius. The cult of the genius of Trump is now among us, and it is a very, very dangerous and toxic product, which we don't recommend. We're not going to be following it here. But that's sort of the idea. Prestige and the gut will not be in. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of a World Crisis Radio. It is once again here in Washington, Friday the 11th of May. And we are dealing with the usual pattern of crisis up and down the line. During the course of the week, we have developed these two concepts of direct and indirect appeasement. Indirect appeasement is if you say, lift all sanctions on Russia, lift all sanctions on individual Russian oligarchs, have a summit, do things that are more or less public and that involve directly the Russian Federation, whereas indirect appeasement is more along the lines of do things that are destructive to the United States, that are destructive to Europe, to Japan, South Korea, and so forth. And therefore, the Russian angle does not even occur necessarily, although they are in many ways the beneficiary of these things. Right? We've done a lot of work on that during the week. I urge you, go to americansystem.tv, and subscribe. You can go back and play all of those in an afternoon, so you get the idea. So we're now dealing with direct and indirect appeasement. The reason for the change, of course, is that direct appeasement is harder to do now because of Mueller, because of the continuing focus of the media on essentially Russian appeasement. So that makes it harder. It's harder to make concessions directly. Political price is much higher. And this, of course, this was a problem, say, for Sir Neville Chamberlain, right? There's this interesting scene in one of the books about that period where Chamberlain is actually talking to an envoy sent from Berlin, and the Berlin representative says, why are you doing some of these things that make it harder for us? And Chamberlain says, look, you're forcing me to do these things because I can't keep my majority in the parliament if I don't put up some kind of an anti-German front, the anti-German illusion. And if I don't, I'll fall. I won't have my majority. So why don't you cool it a little bit, work a little bit more quietly, and we can get a whole lot more done. Now, we're proposing, once again, that in addition to the Nobel Peace Prize, we should remember that the other thing that's going to be awarded September of this year, right, the 80th anniversary of the Munich sellout, is the much vaunted and much desired Chamberlain Umbrella Award, the Sir Neville Chamberlain Umbrella for the greatest appeaser. And that's another thing that's on the agenda for the end of September. Now, in terms of the psychological atmosphere, here we have the story of a cabinet meeting on Wednesday. This was a cabinet meeting here in the U.S. on Wednesday, presided over by Trump. And I think the main thing is focused on one person. But before we even get to this, Trump lashed out at the cabinet, especially Nielsen, when he was told that the number of people arrested for illegally crossing the Mexican border had topped 50,000 for the second consecutive month. Now, this is a momentary upward spike. Remember, the levels had been very low a year ago. All of this stuff is year over year, in addition to being month by month. So at that time, of course, there was the great fear, right, that the cattle cars and the holding pens and the box cars would be readied and so forth. And we're not out of danger. That's all being done a little bit more surreptitiously. It's being done. So now, anyway, there's a certain increase in the flow in. And so here, Trump lashed out. The blow-up lasted for more than 30 minutes. 30 minutes. If you've ever been in a situation like this, you know what it's like. The blow-up lasted for 30 minutes, according to a person with knowledge of what transpired. Trump's face reddened, and he raised his voice, focusing in particular on the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, the blonde, remember her? So he raised his voice at her, saying Nielsen needs to close down the border. And here's a quote from Don to Nielsen at fever pitch. Why don't you have the solutions? How is this still happening? We need to shut it down. We're closed. The tirade, Trump's tirade, went on for so long that many present began fidgeting in their seats and flashing grimaces, White House aides said. Eventually, the topic moved on to healthcare, bringing relief from the room. Nielsen had battled back, reminding Trump that there are laws that govern what she can do to block the flow of undocumented immigrants. Sessions defended Nielsen, saying that the administration is looking for new ways to deter illegal crossings, but Nielsen struggled to get a word in edgewise. This is from the Washington Post. It's from the New York Times, from Politico. If you have a cabinet, you've also got to remember that you've got problems in the sense that if you alienate all of them, suppose you go on with this, right, for a couple of weeks, and they're fidgeting and flashing grimaces, you've got to remember that that body can, with the help of Pence, if you could get Pence's help, they can vote you out of office. They can invoke the 25th Amendment. Has Trump forgotten that? Does he not take it seriously? His friend Bannon had a kind of a running count of what's going on. You can see all about this in the Homeland episodes of the recent weeks, in the designated survivor episodes. Trump has a vendetta against Nielsen because she's not tough enough. She's a George W. Bush person. She's also a Kelly person. And there's some interesting speculation that that Trump simply doesn't understand the government. He doesn't understand why she can't simply order mass roundups, mass dragnets, mass incarceration camps, and so forth, and so on. Now, I would recommend, we can't go through a lot of details on this, but the very interesting German movie known in English as Downfall, right? Downfall, 2004. This is Der Untergang, and it's the story of the bunker in Berlin in the last days of April, May 1945. The performance in particular by Bruno Ganz in the role of the leader. And in particular, we'd want you to look at the evocation there of April 22nd, 1945, when the news gets out in the bunker that the so-called, the expected counterattack by SS General Felix Steiner has never occurred because there never were the forces needed to do it. There was no Steiner attack. Here we're reading from The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer, a good way to get into these subjects. Not the last word, but for a lot of people, a very useful first word. There was no Steiner attack. It was never attempted. It existed only in the feverish mind of the desperate dictator. When he finally was forced to recognize this, the storm broke. We'll be back with more of this in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So again, that movie, The Downfall, Der Untergang, 2004, Bruno Ganz, a tremendous performance. You've seen this on the internet, on YouTube and so forth. It's often mocked. They often attach different words to it. But this is something that did happen. William L. Shirer puts it at April 22nd, the last turning point in Hitler's road to ruin. He's expecting this counterattack by Steiner. He doesn't get any news. The blow-up of the day came at the daily military conference. They want news about Steiner, but there is none. And the word is that the withdrawal of troops from the north of Berlin to support Steiner south of Berlin had so weakened the front that the Russians had broken through north of Berlin and their tanks were now within the city limits. And here we can quote from William L. Shirer, "This was too much for the supreme warlord. All the surviving witnesses testified that he completely lost control of himself. He flew into the greatest rage of his life. This was the end, he shrieked. Everyone had deserted him. There was nothing but treason, lies, corruption, and cowardice. It was all over." So it is the alienation, the estrangement from reality that comes forward, that becomes the essential feature. So this was a further attack, a further example of the loss of contact with reality. Reality. When you have someone who lives in a fantasy world, then that can become a world catastrophe. And we should take that, I think, very, very seriously. So Nielsen, we're told, she was writing, she drew up a letter of resignation. She was convinced not to do it. There's undoubtedly going to be more commentary about this, but who knows where this all leads us. Now, in terms of signs of internal decomposition and disintegration, in response to this tantrum, I guess, we've got Senator Grassley, our old adversary, Senator Ghastly of Iowa, who puts out a call. He says, hey, if there are any justices on the Supreme Court who are getting ready to resign, you better do it now. You better do it in the next couple of weeks. It's thought to be an appeal to Justice Anthony Kennedy, and it is an exercise in would-be court packing. He's saying we want more reactionary judges, more out-and-out reactionaries on the Supreme Court, and therefore we need to do that now. He's figuring that, as Mitch McConnell has said, the Senate could be lost to the Republicans. From our point of view, that the Senate should be lost to the Republicans. There's also a call, I believe this is from Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, reactionary Republican. He's appealing to Mitch to keep the Senate in Washington during August so that they can show their voters that they're good little worker bees. But it also means that they're going to be passing lots and lots of these reactionary judges. We've just had an example of a pro-Trump reactionary judge, a Trump appointee, on the federal bench, essentially making a mess of that case vis-a-vis the Russians on the Internet Research Agency and Prigozhin, right? Those people that had been indicted. So we also have here one other thing. The usual formula here in the United States has been that it's the right-wingers, right? The reactionaries are the ones who are pro-war. This goes back to Vietnam primarily, right? The reactionaries are pro-war, whereas the leftists are anti-war. This is not universal. And you had these intervals when there was a pro-Obama left that was essentially humanitarian bombers, cruise missile humanitarian bombers. But if you go back to Europe, say in 1939, 40, 41, you'll see that the leftists were interested in resisting the Axis dictators, whereas the reactionaries, the right-wingers, were appeasers, right-wing appeasers. And this is hard for people to get, but this seems to be the way that it's going. Now, in terms of the lineup, right, the war cabinet, it's clear we've got Pompeo and we've got Bolton. Pompeo, his background, he's enjoyed support from the Koch brothers. Bolton has enjoyed support from the Mercers, right? So they've both got billionaire sponsors, in effect, have had at different times. We've now got this Gina Haspel, and I don't know whether she can be stopped. She should be stopped. This is, of course, a mockery of any notion of the dignity, respect for the Geneva Convention, treaties, the rule of law, all that stuff. So she's the former commandant of this black site in Thailand, and she has, under her auspices, there was waterboarding, and she did preside over the destruction of evidence. Now, how that did not end up as a obstruction of justice case, I do not know. I guess the statute of limitation has run out, but she should be defeated. It's time for senators to vote no against her, and I think we went through all the reasons for this during the week. Please subscribe to the AmericanSystem.tv, the AmericanSystem.tv. But in the case of Haspel, the notion is that she's going to be a tool of Pompeo, that somehow she's a protege right now of Pompeo. That's how she got nominated, right? Was it Pompeo who recommended her to Trump? All of the CIA people, or many of them, are lining up to support her. And this is morally very, very dubious. Part of it seems to be that they fear that if it's not Haspel, it may be somebody who's even worse, right? Somebody from Fox News, right? Maybe, I don't know, Lou Dobbs or something like this. That seems to be what they're afraid of. But the moral problem, of course, is that if she was repeatedly asked, can you just say that torture is immoral? And this is important because if you're told that you have to refuse an illegal order, if you're told that you have to refuse an order that goes against international law, well, that's the starting point. She's not capable of doing it. So don't get Haspel, the tool of Pompeo, to the CIA top floor. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., hoping that you're going to join us daily, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, at AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. Now, Cohen, the fixer, the crony, the lawyer, the fixer, many interesting questions. If he took money from Novartis, a company based in Switzerland, did he register as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. If the money came from the Russian oligarch Vekselberg, well, that guy's under sanctions. If you take money, if you take a payment from Vekselberg, 500,000, then you violated the sanctions. There's, of course, a whole lot more. A lot of people wondering, the rule in the mob is you've got to kick up. In other words, out of your income, since you're getting protection from the mob, you've got to realize that you got to pay for that. So if you get money coming in, you've got to set aside and earmark a significant proportion of that, depends on which family you're working for, and you've got to pay that to your superior. So is Cohen kicking up? We know that Trump hates the idea that anybody's making money off him and he's not getting a cut. So was he delivering a cut of this money to Don? Was he, in effect, kicking up? So kicking up, foreign agent questions, sanctions violations questions, and of course it looks like part of it was the question of having influence on the pharmaceutical front. We have some news about that. We may not get to it today, but certainly on Monday, tune in. The prescription drug prices stuff, largely a bunch of eyewash, but we'll go through it. So Novartis is Swiss, it's foreign, and Vekselberg is certainly Russian, and he's been sanctioned. So what's the story with that? And the idea was also he was supposed to convince Trump that the AT&T Time Warner should be allowed to go forward. Trump had said he didn't want it because he thought that would make CNN stronger. He wanted Time Warner to be forced to divest CNN, leave them on their own, and hope that they could be driven out of business. Now, a couple of very, very interesting Watergate parallels here. One is, of course, Pence. Pence, yesterday or the day before, says it's time to end the probe. It's time for Mueller to wrap it up. It's gone on too long. Well, this is, once again, an eerie echo of President Richard Nixon, January 30th, 1974, the State of the Union address. Nixon says, 1 year of Watergate is enough. And that same day, the grand jury requested to meet with him. They had been impaneled on June 5th, 1972, 18 months of Watergate. And the way this occurred was the foreman of the grand jury, coaxed by the prosecutors, by, in this case, Jaworski, I guess, the foreman of the grand jury wrote to Nixon requesting that he appear before the grand jury in any appropriate place. Now, the State of the Union, we're quoting here from the sort of the summary of all of the surface stuff. I would say not exactly the internal dynamics, but certainly all of the phenomena are cataloged here in the book by Stanley I. Cutler, The Wars of Watergate. Here we read on page 449, the State of the Union message spelled out Nixon's position. He had complied with the court order for documents. The special prosecutor had gotten everything he needs. Further requests are only partisan and personal enmities. He had demonstrated his willingness that the affair be ended, and he had provided the means. So this was a public posture of being reasonable, and it went together with the private stonewalling. And in his notes, he said, I've got to stop the flow of evidence. This is now quoting from what was discovered later. Quote, I wanted to stop it. In the past, I had made the grievous mistake of saying that I was going to stop it, but failing to do so. Then, after paying the political price for refusing, we would cave in when the pressure started to build. I regretted not having followed my instincts. Oh, my God, the instincts about this in the way in the past, and I wanted to begin following them, my instincts, right away. I even talked about destroying the tapes. Well, you should have he should have gone on to do that. Now, the other one, though, the funny parallel is also the question of Bebe Rebozo. This is really a blast from the past. Bebe Rebozo was a Florida real estate speculator who later became a banker, the Key Biscayne Bank. And Nixon, when Nixon had time off, he wanted to go to Florida too, just like Trump. But he didn't have Mar-a-Lago. He had to go to the estate of Charles Bebe Rebozo, his crony. And let's see what we can glean about this. They found, for example, back in 71, 72, Nixon found that a couple of journalists were writing stories about Bebe Rebozo. A newspaper reporter had written a series of stories on the activities of presidential crony Bebe Rebozo. John Dean told one of Nixon's operatives to go to the Internal Revenue Service and get them to investigate this reporter, keep him away from Bebe Rebozo. And how about this? This is another very interesting one. Bebe Rebozo, at a certain point, there arose this case of Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker had been a crony of Lyndon B. Johnson. He had been jailed for larceny, fraud, and tax evasion, and he was considered to be disaffected. So Nixon wanted to home in on this Bobby Baker, again in the clink, and he thought that he could glean stuff. So what did they do? They tried to approach Bobby Baker. He got any good scandals about Larry O'Brien or about Senator Muskie? Muskie was the candidate, was the opponent that Nixon really feared for 1972. And the president told Haldeman, chief of staff, that Bebe Rebozo, his friend, was going to go see Bobby Baker in jail, I guess, adding, if Bobby Baker can help us, we will help him, presumably with a pardon. Baker had been sentenced to prison in January 71. Maybe he was still on the outside. So this was a response to the Democrats' $1 million lawsuit against the committee to reelect the president, the infamous creep. But get it? Dangling pardons. History repeats itself. Dangling pardons through the help of these cronies. Now here's another one. This is now it gets to be money. There was Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes was a sometime supporter of Nixon. So Howard Hughes had been, you've seen the movies. He's an aviator, TWA, all kinds of stuff. Hollywood, many, many things, went crazy, on and on. So when in the course of this infighting, we have an example which is going to turn out to be uncanny, and we'll give it to you here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. So for the last segment here of World Crisis Radio, we're just wrapping up some uncanny parallels with Nixon and the Watergate period. And we just got through the part about dangling pardons. We've heard that kind of talk. We've had pardons dangled. But now money, kicking up money for those on the take. So in the course of this fighting, the issue in this moment was the Howard Hughes-Nixon connection, that this was some support. The Internal Revenue Service was auditing a possible opponent of Nixon's, and the columnist Jack Anderson reports a leak about Howard Hughes, the tycoon, but increasingly eccentric. Howard Hughes had made a payment of $100,000 to Nixon, to President Nixon, through Bebe Rebozo. So Bebe Rebozo's bank account got the $100,000, and then it's supposed to go on to Nixon, and apparently it did. Las Vegas journalist Hank Greenspun told Herb Klein, I think that Herb Klein would be Nixon's press secretary, told Herb Klein that he, Greenspun, had information that the money from Howard Hughes, the 100K, had been used to furnish Nixon's estate in San Clemente, California. And there was even some stuff in there about Donald Nixon, President Nixon's brother, being involved in influence peddling and similar stuff. So there we go. Nothing new under the sun. Well, this stuff is new under the sun. Now, supposedly one of the big attacks on the regime comes from George Will, not one of our favorite people, and we'll refrain from the usual name calling. Part of that is a mnemonic, right? Part of the reason for the name calling is it helps you to remember these people, right? Like she of China, she who must be obeyed. That helps people remember who we're talking about. But this is now George Will in the Washington Post and other syndicated papers on May 10th, usually Thursday. The fine art of governing by groveling. Well, this is now about Pence, who, as we say, is out there in the footsteps of Nixon, saying that the Mueller probe should be over. 1 year was enough. Yeah. How about 4 years of Benghazi? No indictments. How about 2 years of Hillary Clinton email? No indictments. Mueller, less than 1 year. And 25 indictments? So get serious, would you? The Republicans, huh? So the fine art of governing by groveling. Now, the idea here is that Pence is the most cringing toady, that he's the valet, he's a servant, that he's absolutely without dignity. He's the authentic voice of today's lickspittle Republican Party. I think they're getting at what we usually say bootlicking. He's a bootlicker. Vote Republican to ratify groveling as governing. And it goes back to that famous cabinet meeting last June when they went around the room and they had to do the forelock tugging. In other words, put your head down and bow to the leader. They had to thank Trump for the blessing and the privilege of being able to serve. Priebus lost the blessing in August. Tom Price lost the blessing as well. Charter flights. I can't thank you enough for the privileges you've given me, said Price. And Pence, similarly, praising Trump once every 12 seconds for 3 minutes. I'm deeply humbled, and so on. So Will is boasting that thanks to his column, we have Mike Pence described as oleaginous, greasy, slimy, oily. Yeah, oleaginous, right? Bearing oil, oleo, right? Stuff like this. So a toady, he's obsequious, he's America's most repulsive public figure. The idea being that Pence has now outdistanced Trump as the most repulsive public figure, and he's therefore stolen Trump's thunder. I think maybe he's going to get in trouble based on this. Pence flew to the Indiana Colts football game because he knew that there would be a protest and he wanted the chance to posture by walking out. He has praised Joe Arpaio as a paragon of law and order, and Will then tries to compare that to Abraham Lincoln, who spent some of his formative years from 1816 to 1830 in Indiana, and he regards that as the prelude to the Young Men's Lyceum, Springfield, Illinois speech of January 27th, 1838. So you get the idea. There will be negligible legislation by the next Congress, so ballots cast this November will be most important as validations or repudiations of harmonizing voices such as Trump, Pence, Arpaio, and the like. Trump is what he is, a floundering, inarticulate jumble of gnawing insecurities and not at all compensating vanities, which is pathetic. Pence is what he has chosen to be, and that is horrifying. I'm afraid the thing with Will, as usual, is an attempt to take the verbal pyrotechnics, right? I guess you've got a nice Roget's thesaurus, Will. You've got the big vocabulary, the big words, right? Maybe not as big as you think. Maybe there are competitors out there. Don't look too far. The question of vocabulary richness, English language, of course, has 1 million words, more than just about any other that we know of. But the verbal pyrotechnics, right? This show-off act, oleaginous, unctuous, on and on. Condign, he has a whole bunch of words that he tries to pull out. This is used as a smokescreen with Will. It's a smokescreen. He ought to be saying, not that Trump and that they're loathsome individuals, but the question of, is there insanity? Is there actual insanity? Is there mental illness? Are we close to the 25th? Has there been bribery? Is there psychosis? Is there treason? These are the questions, right? And you can ask those questions in rather simpler terms. A combination of Elmer Gantry, Sinclair Lewis, right? The religious demagogue Burt Lancaster played him in a pretty good movie, and Uriah Heep, the Nixon Dickens character, where he says something will come up. So he's sort of meek and but not really, right? He's waiting for his main chance. Well, Will, what are you saying? Should we follow the example of 1973-74 by which Agnew was forced out first, that Agnew was indicted, and then Nixon was was threatened to be Watergated out? Is that what you want? Why don't we get down to business, right? A few big words, right, will not do the job. Now, Scarborough does somewhat better. Scarborough says, we now have the question about Pence. What did Pence know, and when did he know it? Did Flynn really lie to Pence, or is that just a cover story? In other words, was Pence more of an active reading participant in nefarious activities than he has attempted to portray himself? We're thinking of Tartuffe, right, from Moliere, right? When you get religious hypocrisy, trying to cover up for malfeasance and nonfeasance, that's when it's get really bad. So maybe you want to compare Pence to somebody like Senator Sam Paley in the Homeland series, and not just Elmer Gantry. Okay? So again, this is not really big radical destructive attack that some commentators have pretended. So we'll see you next week here on World Crisis Radio, and on Monday, the American System.